For 300 years, nobody dared to ask what was actually behind it. Then a research team finally cracked it open, and what they found made even the most experienced geologists go silent. This is the story nobody expected to be true. It started, as these things so often do, with a handful of shaky phone videos passed quietly between hikers, amateur geologists, and a small online community obsessed with unexplained rock formations. The clips were grainy, poorly lit, and shot from awkward angles, the kind of footage that gets dismissed within seconds on most days. A section of an ancient basalt cliff face along Ireland's northern coast appeared to shift. Not crumble, not crack, not slide the way loose stone typically does after a storm. It seemed to swing, almost like a hinge buried somewhere deep inside the rock itself, before settling back into place so cleanly that within minutes you couldn't tell anything had moved at all. Most people who saw the footage assumed exactly what you'd assume. A trick of the light. A lens flare. Maybe a clever bit of editing meant to rack up views. The coastline in question, famous for its thousands of tightly packed hexagonal basalt columns, already attracts its share of folklore, so a new legend forming around it wasn't exactly shocking. But then a handful of hikers who happened to be nearby that afternoon began describing the same thing independently, without having seen each other's footage first, and their accounts lined up in a way that pure coincidence usually doesn't allow. Several described a seam in the rock face that seemed to separate along an almost unnaturally straight line, opening just wide enough to suggest depth behind it, before closing again with no sound, no dust, and no debris. The coastline where all this supposedly happened isn't some obscure patch of shoreline. It's one of the most studied stretches of geology in the world, formed roughly 60 million years ago when a massive volcanic episode sent lava pouring across the region in sheets. As those sheets cooled at different rates, the rock contracted and split into tens of thousands of columns, most of them with 5 or 6 flat sides, packed together so tightly that early visitors assumed no natural process could have made them. For centuries, local storytelling filled that gap, with tales of giants building causeways across the sea. Geologists eventually explained the mechanism in detail, and the site earned recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage location decades ago, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors a year who come to walk across columns that look almost too regular to be real. That's exactly what made the videos so unsettling to the people who understood the rock best. Basalt doesn't behave like a door. It doesn't hinge, and it doesn't reseal itself. When large sections of volcanic rock actually move, whether from erosion, frost wedging, or plain gravity, they leave a mess behind. Fresh fractures, loose gravel, pale, unweathered stone exposed where the surface used to be. None of that showed up anywhere in the footage, and that absence bothered one particular viewer far more than the movement itself ever could. His name doesn't matter as much as his background does. He'd spent close to 2 decades doing fieldwork on ancient stone structures across Ireland and the wider British Isles, the kind of career built on rejecting exciting stories in favor of boring, verifiable measurements. When colleagues sent him the clips half-joking, expecting him to laugh them off within a minute, he didn't. He watched them slow down frame by frame, looking specifically for the thing that should have. Bright enough to momentarily overpower the crawler's own lamps, then vanished just as quickly. There was no lingering glow, no visible object left behind, nothing obvious causing it. The team reviewed that section of footage repeatedly afterward, ruling out lens flare, equipment malfunction, and reflection off the standing pools of liquid. None of those explanations quite fit what the recording showed. To date, nobody involved has offered a confirmed cause for it. Not long after that flash, the mission ran into practical trouble. The ground beneath the crawler grew increasingly unstable, its tracks losing grip in the soft, damp material covering the floor. At the same time, the video signal began breaking up, flickering through bursts of static that made it harder and harder to make out details. About 20 meters in, the crawler simply couldn't push forward anymore, and with the connection at real risk of failing entirely, the team made the call to bring it back rather than risk losing the unit, and every second of footage it had already captured. They sealed the borehole carefully once the crawler was safely out, patching it well enough that, by most accounts, a casual visitor walking past that stretch of coastline today wouldn't notice anything unusual about the rock face at all. No formal announcement followed. No dramatic press conference. No headline confirming a hidden chamber beneath one of the world's most visited geological sites. The footage and survey notes have circulated mostly within small research and enthusiast circles since, generating plenty of debate, but no official consensus. What's clear is that this wasn't a natural sea cave in the conventional sense, at least according to the people who were actually there. The absence of airflow, the unusually even floor, the ceiling structures, the unexplained flash, none of it fits cleanly into standard cave formation. Whether that points to some overlooked geological process still poorly understood, an unusual mineral phenomenon, or something else entirely is still an open question, and probably will stay that way until someone goes back in with better equipment and a lot more caution. One detail that rarely comes up in the shorter retellings of this story is just how much scrutiny the original footage went through before anyone took it seriously enough to act. Long before the archaeologists got involved, a handful of amateur researchers tried to debunk the clips themselves, running them through basic frame analysis, checking metadata, and comparing shadow angles against known sun positions for that stretch of coastline on the dates the videos were supposedly recorded. None of that casual scrutiny turned up obvious signs of manipulation, which is part of why the clips kept circulating instead of dying out the way most hoax footage does within a week or two. It's worth being honest about the limits of that kind of amateur verification. It isn't the same as a formal forensic review, but it was enough to keep serious people curious rather than dismissive. It also helps to understand why the location itself makes any claim like this land so differently than it would somewhere more obscure. This isn't a remote hillside nobody visits. It's one of the most photographed, most walked, most geologically documented coastlines on the planet, visited by hundreds of thousands of people a year and studied by professional geologists for well over a century. Every visible inch of that basalt formation has been mapped, measured, and explained in academic literature going back generations. That's precisely why a genuinely unexplained feature turning up there carries more weight than it would almost anywhere else. It's not new territory. Water. Just a kind of stillness that, according to the archaeologists' later account, felt more unsettling than anything visible in the original footage. That silence suggested two very different possibilities, and neither one was especially comforting. Either this cavity had somehow remained completely sealed off from the outside environment for an extraordinarily long time despite constant wind, rain, and salt spray battering the coastline above it, or something about its structure had kept it isolated in a way ordinary weathering shouldn't allow. Rather than guess, the team widened the borehole just enough to fit a small remote-operated crawler unit equipped with lights and a camera, tested the connection thoroughly, and sent it in ahead of any people. For the first stretch, the footage from inside looked almost disappointingly normal. Rough, uneven basalt walls stretched into the dark exactly the way you'd expect inside any volcanic cavity. Then the floor changed. Instead of the jagged, broken surface near the entrance, the crawler rolled onto ground that looked distinctly smoother, more level, almost as if something had worn it down evenly rather than the chaotic way natural erosion usually behaves. It wasn't polished stone or an obviously carved surface, nothing that dramatic, but it was different enough that everyone reviewing the live feed noticed immediately. Further in, the lights caught a cluster of dark, irregular shapes hanging from the ceiling, clustered in a way that didn't quite match typical mineral formations like stalactites. They didn't reflect the crawler's lights the way wet stone normally does. Instead, they seemed to absorb most of it, leaving their exact shapes hard to make out on camera. Reviewing the footage afterward frame by frame, the team also noted what they described as extremely subtle shifts in the position of these shapes between frames. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested movement in any conventional sense, but enough of a discrepancy that nobody on the team could offer a confident geological explanation for it. The leading theory floated afterward was some kind of mineral deposit still slowly forming or shifting under condensation, though nobody could say that with real certainty. As the crawler pushed deeper, the ground grew softer and damper, and shallow pools of dark liquid started appearing across the uneven floor. It wasn't seawater seeping in. Testing later suggested a mineral composition that didn't match typical coastal groundwater in the area, and its surface kept producing small ripples even when the crawler was sitting completely still, with no wind and no flowing water anywhere nearby to explain it. Above all this, running along the ceiling in long, strikingly even lines, were formations that looked less like the chaotic natural cracking you'd expect from cooling lava and far more like deliberate structural lines, spaced at intervals that lined up almost exactly with the hanging shapes below. None of this constitutes proof of anything beyond what it visibly is, an unusual, previously unrecorded cavity with some genuinely strange internal features. But it's easy to understand why, watching that footage, an experienced field scientist started questioning assumptions he'd built an entire career on. The most talked about moment in the whole recovered footage happened without warning, deep into the crawler's run. A brief, sharp flash of light appeared somewhere ahead in the darkness.
It's one of the most examined patches of rock in the world, subtly showing something nobody had ever documented before. The archaeologist involved has always been careful about how he frames what he experienced, and that caution is worth taking seriously rather than glossing over for the sake of a better story. He has never claimed to have found proof of anything beyond an unusual, previously undocumented cavity, with several features he personally couldn't explain, using standard geological knowledge. He's been explicit that correlation isn't causation, that unexplained doesn't mean impossible, and that the honest scientific position is to say the evidence raised more questions than it answered rather than to leap toward any dramatic conclusion. That kind of restraint doesn't make for the flashiest headline, but it's part of what makes the account credible to the small community of researchers who've reviewed his notes and the recovered footage since. Independent attempts to revisit the site haven't gone especially far. Access to that stretch of coastline is tightly controlled given its protected heritage status, and any further excavation would require formal permits, environmental review, and sign-off from multiple regulatory bodies before a single additional hole could legally be drilled. That bureaucratic reality is a big part why the story hasn't progressed much further in the time since. It isn't secrecy in the dramatic, conspiratorial sense so much as the fairly ordinary slowness a protected site permitting, paired with a research team that seems in no particular hurry to reopen something they weren't entirely comfortable with in the first place. For now, the coastline looks exactly the way it always has. Visitors still walk across those tightly packed columns every day, take their photos, listen to the old legends about giants building a path across the sea, and head home without any idea that a few meters beneath their feet, sealed carefully back up, sits a space nobody has fully explained. Maybe it never gets reopened. Maybe someday somebody goes back with the right team and the right equipment and finally settles what's down there for good. Until then, it stays exactly what it's been from the start. One of the more genuinely strange stories connected to a landscape that's already spent millions of years making people wonder what else it might be hiding. What do you think is really down there? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to like and subscribe for more.